Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. Every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 o'clock, we talk about some of the things that are going on in the world that may affect you economically or financially, some of the things that are happening that you may wonder about or just kind of say, does that really make sense? Or why do we do it that way? Or why is it that way? And so that's kind of the purpose of the show. It's not financial planning, but it is. We of course talk about matters that would affect you financially. It's not, but it's not one of the shows where I tell you how to make $1 million or $10 million or your life so you can retire in the island someplace. It's more about some of the things that are going on and whether they make economic sense. The interesting thing about economics is, as I say on the show all the time, is that no matter what you want the answer to be, uh, it's going to end up being the same thing all the time. Um, this is truly one of those areas where uh, you can be you can be stupid by doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It just doesn't happen. And that's true in many, many, many areas. But sometimes the interesting thing about economics is that uh, it is one of those kind of things where it can get very complicated. Uh, the and so when you get into the details, many times it's you can get diverted. You can think something's happening that's not happening. You can think that you're going to get an outcome this time that's different than the outcome you got last time. But but in general, when you step back, it's much easier to um, to look at it. That's why the microeconomic situation for micro is is what happens in business and what happens in the economy in general. Individually, the effect of companies, the economic impact on companies. That's kind of the micro. Macro is more the governmental type of stuff, gross domestic product, gross national product, things like that, and more of a national and global situation. So sometimes it it helps when you can take kind of a macro view of something, even as it relates to business. Then sometimes the micro, because you get lost in the stuff in between, and that stuff doesn't necessarily change the outcome, but it does change. It can change the timing of the outcome. It can change, you know uh, how that is presented or what the perception of the outcome is. And that does make a difference because a lot of this reaction that we get, a lot of the economics is mass movement in a capitalistic market, in a free market. You end up with it's how the people react. So if you can get a large number of people to react in a certain manner, you could have an impact. But in that situation, it would take a large, a very very large um, market and it would take a big swing. So ultimately, if you truly have a free market, we've talked about that. You have to have equal buyers and sellers from a strength standpoint. It's not necessarily always numbers, but you have to have equal strengths on both sides of the equation from a practical standpoint. Because if you don't, you won't get a fair price or equilibrium price that's reasonable based on what everybody is, or not reasonable, but what's fair based on what everybody is trying to accomplish. And in economics, an unfair price is one where there's an unfair profit built in. In other words, there's a that because of the strength of one party, let's say an Amazon or an Apple, that they're able to force a transaction at a price that somebody else can't afford or can't compete with. um, they're able to accomplish a transaction, and the person that's on the other side has no choice. I'll give you kind of an interesting example. I was talking to a friend of mine recently that was talking, and he's connected with a nursing home, And so the state now is talking to the nursing homes about testing, and they've got this new 2-hour test or whatever it is, this rapid test that they're rolling out. So they want the nursing homes to test twice a day, all of the residents and all of the staff. Well, there's probably about about 180 residents and about 300 staff. So there's about 480 people that are going to be tested twice a day. Um, so uh, you know the the problem is that sounds great, but the problem is that the test is $100 a test. So you've got $48,000 once during the day and another $48,000 again that later in the day. So you've got $96,000 a day for testing. Well, there's no reimbursement for that right now. There's no coverage of that in the nursing home. The state has given people money, in this situation, almost $1 million, which will run out in 10 days. And that's all. It's a one-time deal. So, they got about 10 days worth of testing before, it's costing them $96,000 a day. And, so would you do that? I mean, you would push back on that on that testing company and get the price reduced, but there's no opportunity to do that. That is what the price is. You can't push back on the state and say we're not doing it, so that you can force you could force the demand for the test down, so that they would have to, if the demand for it goes down, the price will go down. But the government's mandating it, so there's no opportunity to get a price that doesn't have a unfair profit in it for the testing company, or for the government. It depends on which, what happens. But either way, that's the kind of situation when you have very few players on both sides of the table. It gets very difficult to come up with a reasonable price. So that's the kind of thing that that makes it difficult, is when you don't have that kind of equilibrium, that kind of equal partner on each side of the equation. So so that's just a small example of, in today's COVID world, some of the issues that are taking place from a practical standpoint, and could affect the outcome of a transaction, because the players in this are large entities, and or monopolies. They're the entities that control, whether they be governments or whatever else. It's kind of difficult to get a reasonable price in that situation. So anyway, that's kind of what just a small example of what we're talking about here and what the impact is. So, I thought that it was kind of interesting that that we're struggling with this situation, and it shows how part of what's happening with some of this related to the COVID is that there's a huge cost involved in this thing that is going to be mandated, and it's not going to be one of those kind of things where it's going to be it's going to be a cheap process. There's some costs involved here that are going to be borne by people, that by the government potentially, that ultimately we're all going to pay for. That is all going to be passed on to us, because government can't buy anything or pay for anything. They can't create anything. They don't earn any income. They're strictly a cost. They're an intermediary between the people and other people, basically, is what it boils down to. So, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And some of the difficulty that you have is that, you're not going to get any kind of reasonable reaction to this, any kind of fair price. So so that's one of the things I wanted to kind of look at today. The other thing I was going to mention today is I want to talk a little bit about the situation that we have with this payroll tax holiday. I like a lot of the stuff that's happening, but with taxes, we've had that has had a significant impact on on the economy. The tax reductions have produced a boost in economic activity, because basically what we're doing is shifting some of that cash back to the businesses. And when you reduce costs in one area, which taxes are a cost, it allows the business to increase in other areas. It's not going to necessarily allow it to produce an unfair return. It's not going to necessarily increase the return to the investors per se, but it will allow you to remain competitive from an investment standpoint. It'll allow you to remain competitive and still be able to hire more labor. And that's why we saw jobs increased. It allowed you to hire more labor, and it allows you to hire more materials. Of course, if you're hiring more materials, somebody's producing the materials, that's creating more labor. So either way, it's an opportunity there was an opportunity to spur in the economy. So that is, that's one of those things that, is really has had a big impact. And like I said, I'm in favor of a lot of that type of thing. The putting dollars back into the system and creating a reduced tax burden is allowing businesses to shift into other areas where they can create jobs or create economic growth. And so it does have a stimulus effect. It's always going to have a stimulus effect when you reduce taxes or throw money into the system. It's the same thing with these PPP loans and the EIDL loans. That's a huge amount of stimulus in the system. And for right now, it's more money going into the system than going out. Now, when you have to start repaying that, or if you have to start repaying it, then there's more money going out. So it's going to be a problem potentially. And that's something that business is going to have to deal with. That has to be paid off at some point. The EIDLs do. The PPPs, if you're lucky, some portion or all of it's going to be forgiven. It depends on, on what you did and how you handled that money. But one of the things that I have a problem with that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I don't believe, is this payroll tax holiday that they're talking about. And I know the president's in favor of it, and I understand why. He's trying to put more dollars into the pockets of the individual labor and of the business owner by not requiring that they pay Social Security taxes now. But they have to pay it at some point right now. I know the president's saying if he gets reelected and Democrats are, not running Congress and, all yada, 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 that he's going to make that a permanent reduction. And I know people are saying, well, geez, we really can't afford not to fund Social Security. And they're right. Social Security is broke. It's going broke pretty quickly. And you wouldn't think that, but does a couple months make a difference? Probably makes some difference, but not enough that we're going to go broke immediately. But, it's been a big shell game in Social Security for years. There is no money to pay Social Security. It's coming out of the trust fund. Out of the general fund. It's technically in the Social Security trust fund, but the trust fund doesn't have cash. It's been borrowing money from the general fund for years. So in effect, what the government has is an IOU to itself to pay back, to pay the Social Security fund back. for the dollars it's collecting. So basically, what it's doing is collecting money currently, and instead of putting that money aside for future retirement, which is why it's supposedly being collected, it's being used to pay current benefits. And so, what that's going to mean on this payroll tax holiday is that the government has to borrow more money. That's not a good thing. When the government starts borrowing more money, they force out the private sector. They become, I know, I know in my business, if I go out and say, look, I go to the bank and I say, hey, I want to borrow some money. Would you loan me some money? I want to pay 2.5%, 3%, just like this SBA deal. I want to pay 3%. Well, that bank's going to, after they stop laughing, they're going to say, well, why would I give you money at 3% when I can give money to the United States government and get 3%? That doesn't make sense. So, sorry, either I'm not going to give you the money or I'm going to give you the money at 8% or 7% because there's a lot more risk that I'm not going to get paid. So, so the net effect is it's going to drive up interest rates. There is, even though for a long, long time there was Keynesian economics and things that the ability or the necessity of government borrowing doesn't impact the private sector or the rest of the market in terms of borrowing. In other words, that the government is completely separate and distinct and has an unlimited amount of capital available to borrow. So when they borrow, it doesn't impact the private sector. Well, we've learned over a number of years, even though we've tried that multiple times, that it's wrong. It does affect it. That there may be ways to potentially postpone it. There may be situations where in the short run it's not obvious, or interest rates may not move in the short run because there's some excess liquidity in the system. But at some point in time, when the system starts, when the economy starts to recover, it has an impact. It immediately has an impact on interest rates. And we were seeing that already, even with the recovery before. There was so much money pumped into the system, so much debt in the system, that it was starting to have an impact. There were very few banks out there loaning money that wasn't guaranteed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or SBA. In other words, they basically had the government making the loans. And so, so the government was making loans. Now the government's not going to make loans. They're going to borrow the money at a rate cheaper than what they're making the loan. So from that standpoint, there's never going to be a situation that you're going to come out ahead when the government's the one making the loans in the long run, because if the government needs the money, they're going to keep it first. And that's really what happened. That's really what was starting to happen. And our financial sector just was not competitive, and still is not competitive. It's consolidating. I've heard some numbers. I mean, what's going on right now, and the private banks, the private sector is going through pretty quickly a consolidation in the banking sector, and the big banks are getting stronger, and the small banks are going away. They're being merged into larger regional, because they have to compete. They can't compete. The little mom and pop bank that used to exist, that was the backbone of the local community and the backbone of Main Street economy, and still really is gone. And so if you take that out of the process, where does the banker go? I mean, and it's, I talked about the difference between the government, and the government loaning money and the government guaranteed loans and all of that kind of stuff. And if if you can get money from the government and they'll pay you 3 or 4%, they're not going to loan it to you. You're not going to be able to borrow money at 3 or 4%. You're going to be able to borrow at something above that. Now, that also is true with big companies versus small companies. So if I'm a large company, a SEC traded company, and I'm a large company, I have a lot of financial choices. I can go to what they call the commercial paper market, which is how I borrow almost like CDs. I'm a bank and issuing CDs. I can borrow money that way at rates close to or less than CD rates. I can borrow money at a number of different ways. I've got international markets. I can borrow money internationally. I can arbitrage currency and rates and everything else. So, but as a local business, I can't do that. I don't have that option. Nobody's going to loan me money on the commercial paper market if I'm a $50 million business or a 20 million or a $200,000 business. They're not going to do that. So the bottom line is that it kind of all rolls downhill. You know what they say about it? It all rolls downhill. And the smaller you are, the more you're going to bear the brunt of that, the further down the hill you are. So ultimately, that's exactly what we're looking at in the economy is look at is coming up is that market is going to tighten. There's no question about it. It's going to tighten. And when it does, one of two things are going to happen. Interest rates are going to go through the roof, and we're going to have some serious inflation, or the economy is going to collapse because it can't get funded, and people are going to file bankruptcy and go broke, and the market will collapse. As I've said before, we should favor the second step, not the first step. Hyperinflation is much more, first of all, doesn't correct the problem. It has a tendency to reward the worst players, and it has a tendency to have the biggest impact on the poor, or the people the working poor, the poor who can least afford it, because inflation is an unequal tax and it's an unfair tax. It's regressive, and it is not a good tax. Depression, on the other hand, economic collapse causes a reset of the economy, and the weak players go away. And that hurts if you happen to be a weak player. And some of us will be because we don't have the right technology, or because we couldn't afford to do something that we needed to do, or we didn't position ourselves right. We're not going to make it. We may not be there. And that's hard for all of us to deal with. And that's what makes it very difficult on an individual basis. No small business wants to be out of business. But the fact of the matter is that some are going to have to go away. And as I've said before, the financial institutions are the ones that really, the community banks should be the ones sticking around. And unfortunately, the big banks should be the one that should be paying the penalty, but they're not right now and probably won't. But getting back to Social Security, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is this payroll tax holiday, so to speak. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, what has been proposed, it has not gone through Congress, so it didn't get passed through Congress, because it's not necessarily, because it's in an impasse in Congress, and in fact, the president was in favor of it. Most of the Democrats are not in favor of it from a political standpoint, but a number of Republicans aren't in favor of it from an economic standpoint. And the economic reason is that when you have a retirement system like Social Security that's already out of cash, it's already broke, and is rapidly becoming defunct, do you take more money from it? I mean, that's I think what the basic premise is. But here's the biggest problem I have with it, is that it is not a tax. It is not an elimination of a cost. It's a deferral of a cost. So all you save is, the only thing that it does for you is it gives you the money to use in your business for a period of time. So it's kind of like borrowing money at, let's say, 0%, because there's no cost to it, to borrowing these Social Security dollars. So you're borrowing this money for a period of about a year, maybe a little bit more than that, and then you have to pay it back. So you don't have to pay any interest, but you have to pay it back. So what's the cost of that? Well, if you'd used an EIDL loan or something like that, that cost was 3%, 3.75. So maybe I made 4%, 3.5%, 4% on that money for a period of a year, but then I have to pay it back. So So I didn't really save anything. I mean, it's not real money. It's just a loan. Is all it is. I'm borrowing money from the Social Security Administration is really what I'm doing as a business. Now, this is applied at the business level and it's optional. The business has to make an election, but here's why it probably doesn't make sense. Right now, it's not going to be forgiven. The president says if he's reelected, he'll make sure that that happens, which he really can't. All he can do is hope that he would win Congress, and then he can convince the Republicans and the Democrats to go along with it, and that then they can forgive it. At that point, that would be a tax break. Now, it's a tax break that's going to come technically, it's going to affect the trust fund, the Social Security Trust Fund. But like I said, they're borrowing money from the general fund anyway. So net effect is it's a tax reduction, same as any other tax reduction, same as an income tax reduction or anything else. The thing there is that it's a reduction in tax on wages. So therefore, it should have a positive impact on wage income. And so that's what the president's looking at. He's saying, look, if we would eliminate or reduce the Social Security tax, then businesses could afford to pay more in wages because they wouldn't have the burden of Social Security because they've got to pay half of that. The employee pays half and the company pays half. So they're looking at that and saying, well, they don't have this burden. They can afford to pay more, or, they'll make more. But if they make more, it gives them the opportunity, like I said, taxes are costs. So if they pay less taxes, it gives them the opportunity to still earn the same return, but to increase their labor costs, for example, or their material costs. But in this case, potentially labor costs by increasing salaries. They may be able to pass some or all of that on to the worker, and hire new workers or training or whatever the situation may be, but they have an ability to impact labor. So I understand the goal. The goal is to shift dollars here, there. The goal is to make it, to forgive this ultimately so that you get a tax reduction in the labor area. The hope is that reduction will be passed along as higher wages. That'll give people more money. They'll spend more and ultimately spur the economy. That's the goal. But again, let's take a look at it from a macro standpoint. What's actually happening? Well, what's actually happening is we're taking an entitlement program and we're giving it less money, which means that we have to take it out of the general fund because that's where it's being funded. And when we do that, the government doesn't produce anything. They don't make anything. They're just an arbitrage situation. So what they've done is they've decided to reduce taxes in one area. They're going to have to increase it in another. Ultimately, they may delay it. They may borrow instead of increasing and go further in debt. But ultimately, they're going to have to borrow that money, and they're going to have to borrow more of that money. And so what it means is that we're going to get further and further behind in some area, whether it's Social Security, where we're going to have to cut benefits because it's already doesn't have enough cash. So potentially what we're doing is we're taking money from the retiree and giving it to the person that's working. And that's kind of a difficult situation because we have a lot of retirees that depend upon that money for survival. So if we don't do that, then we've got to take the money from other businesses, other people in other areas. We got to take it in income tax or whatever else. But the fact is that we're going to have to take it from those people that are working, and that's going to cause a burden on them, which is going to force them then to reduce jobs, reduce materials, or cut back. So, like I said, you can squish it however you want to squish it. You can push it down or spread it out, but the net effect is it's going to have the same impact ultimately. It's a question of whether it's going to have an impact on the few or an impact on the many. There are some in the government that would like you to believe it's going to have an effect on only the few, and the few are, in quotations, the wealthy. We finally got a definition of wealthy, and I've been telling people you just need to look at the tax code and you can see what wealthy is. When they start talking about taxing the 1%, those people who are truly wealthy, taxing the 1%, who are they talking about? They're talking about people that make $400,000 or more. Do you consider those truly wealthy? Are those the multimillionaires you're thinking that's going to get taxed? I don't think so. I think for many small businesses, they report that much income on paper all the time. I've got lots of clients that on paper make $400,000 a year. They don't have that kind of cash because it takes the money to run it. And if the government's going to pull that out in taxes, they're not going to have, they're going to have to cut jobs. They're going to have to cut expansion. They're going to have to do a lot of different things, raise prices, which will ultimately have an impact on, because they're in a competitive market, will have an impact on their bottom line. So, so ultimately it is going to have an impact. There's no question about the fact that this all will, would impact somehow. But here's the other problem. So, like I said, it's always good to take a kind of an overview and say, okay, I see what's happening in the short run. This is going to do this. It's going to put more money in the people's pocket. But what's it going to do in the long run? And you look at it from the long run. What we're basically doing is reducing taxes, what we're basically doing is going to reduce benefits ultimately to the retiree, the allocation to the retiree, and exchange that for the working people. So that's going to be tough for a lot of people. It's going to be tough for a lot of retirees. They're not going to be able to afford a lot of the things that retirees can afford, medical expenses through Medicare or other things. They'll have to cut back on those kind of things. Those things won't be available. For example, my comment about nursing homes. If nursing homes were looking at absorbing or passing along, I should say, instead of looking at passing along $96,000 a day in additional testing costs, how fast do you think the government's going to have to reduce Medicare and Medicare coverage for something like that for nursing homes? They're going to eventually say, there's a cap. We're not paying more than X amount of money for your nursing home stay. Well, the nursing home's going to have to charge you for that because they have to pay for it. And they've got to get the money from someplace. Where's it going to come from? Well, it's got to come from the residents. The residents they've got to pay for it. That's either coming out of pocket or it's coming out of some sort of Medicaid or something that the government is subsidizing. And when that happens, what happens there? Well, they're going to get less care. So in effect, what we're doing is we're going to take, from an overall macro level, after it's all funneled out, what we've done is said, we want to reward the working person and we're going to take it away from the retiree. Not a good thing. I mean, in the short run, people say, oh, it doesn't make any difference. We're just move money here, move money there. Look at it in the long run because the long run is all that matters. And you're going to see that that's what's happening. So that's why it does not make sense right now. Now, if the retiree was receiving a very high level of benefit, as opposed to the working person. And that to some degree is happening in that many people are receiving Social Security benefits that are well in excess of what they actually paid into Social Security. And so over their lifetimes, because people are living longer and all that, and that burden for paying that, because there is no trust fund, the money's coming out of the general fund. So that means current tax dollars are paying for current retirees. So and as we have fewer and fewer people as a percentage working, then you have fewer people who can pay those taxes. So what's happening is the retiree benefits that are out there, the burden for that is being basically paid by the young. And so, what we've created is a class warfare between the elderly or the older, and not even elderly, between the older and the younger, because all of this cost is falling on the younger person, the younger worker, the worker who's paid less and who's more impacted by all of this. The only way that's going to change is if we have more people in the U.S. paying Social Security taxes and more workers and more jobs, so that the number of people who are currently paying taxes far exceed the number of people who are retired receiving benefits, so that that balances out. Right now, we don't have that. We don't have that situation. Fortunately, we got a couple things going for us. Immigration for us, the people that come into our country, and the immigrants that come in, They tend to pay into the Social Security system, but don't tend to retire here. They tend to, to leave, go back to their native country when they're done. Some of them bring their families and retire here. But again, um, there's more money that's being spent in that situation by them on their family. They don't look to the government to pay a lot of that because a lot of those people who come here aren't eligible for Social Security. They didn't work in the system, so they're not eligible for that. So immigration ultimately helps us pay those costs. Believe it or not, that's where we can get some of that money if we get people coming in to pay in the system who are not as much of a burden on the system. I mean, ideally, if you had a bunch of people come into the country and work for, let's say, 30 years, um, and then and pay into the Social Security system, and then they don't get a retirement. Let's say they don't get Social Security, they leave the country, they go back and they get retirement in England or someplace or Canada or whatever. That's great for us. We don't pay retirement. We got money paid for our retirees. That's a good thing. That's why that type of immigration is a good thing, as long as people are paying in the system. If they're outside the system, that's a different story. But if they're in the system paying, and they're probably not going to stay here, so that they aren't going to be a burden on the system when they retire, that's ideal for us. I mean, that is the perfect scenario for us. The other thing that we got going for us is, fortunately, we've been locked up. So for a while, there's 3 or 4 or 5 months. So I suspect we're going to have a baby boom, which is kind of a thing that we needed anyway. We've historically, the population has been weaning, and then we had the big, we had of course the major baby boom after World War II, and then we had a subsequent baby boom after, as people came back after the Vietnam War and some of those kind of things. So now we're going to have a COVID boom. Hopefully it'll be a big one. I'm hoping that there was a lot of people that didn't think this through and ultimately are going to create a lot of people who are ultimately going to work. Now, it's going to create a burden on the system as well. But if we can create the jobs, generate the income, we'll have more younger people helping to balance the system out. Right now, the younger people are paying an inordinate portion of the healthcare costs, the retirement costs, and all of those, because there are more of those people taking that healthcare and retiree, and it's getting worse as more and more people are signing up for Medicare. I'm eligible for Medicare this month. I'm not paying into private insurance anymore. I'm paying into Medicare and a supplement. So all of a sudden that stuff's got to be paid for. And the government's the one that's got to pay for it. So we need those younger people working, and that's what's happening. Those younger people are being asked to do that. And right now, as long as the family unit stays intact, let's face it, I don't think anybody minds paying money out of their pocket for their own family. If my kids or grandkids or friends' kids or grandkids or whatever need something, I don't have any problem in kicking in and paying for that. If I can do it, I will do it. And I'm not going to resent it. I don't have a problem with it or anything else. But on the other hand, if I'm trying to do that and the government is taking money out of my pocket, and giving it to somebody else that I don't know, and their situation may be legitimate, but they're not my family, so I don't really want to give my money to somebody. I'd rather give it to my family. If my family needs it first, I want to make sure my family's taken care of. That's why I've worked so long. That's why I've worked so hard. That's why I have a business. That's why I continue to maintain it. It was for the ability to be able to take care of those kids, take care of the grandkids, take care of people that I care about personally. When the government takes it out, it becomes impersonal. It goes to those people who, they may be great people. I'm not saying that. It's just I don't know them anymore. So I don't have that vested interest, that love for them that I do with my family. So therefore, why would I, it starts creating a situation now where you've got more of a anonymous, I don't know who's getting the money. I don't know them personally. So now if I'm the one that you're taking it from, I'm the worker, and you're taking it and giving it to somebody else, now I'm going to start thinking, well, geez, Who are those people? Why should I give them money? I don't have that. I don't have a family. I should get to keep my money. Why should I be giving it to somebody else that is irresponsible and has 14 kids or something? It's one of those type of things. You start creating this class system, this this struggle between the young and the anonymous old. Most young people, my grandkids, don't have a problem helping pop. But I don't think my grandkids, when they're older, will really be that excited about helping somebody else's pop up, somebody they don't know, especially when it's meaning that they can't do for their own families what they need to do to take care of their own families. So what you're doing is creating a class warfare between the young and the old in the government, right, or in the United States right now. That's what's happening. And that's, let's face it, that's being done on purpose, because once that happens, once it becomes faceless, once there's no connection involved in this transfer of money, you create that conflict and you create that revolution that ultimately ends in a redistribution of everybody's income. And that's what the goal is. I mean, that's ultimately what's behind some of that, is a redistribution of wealth and a redistribution of income. It's harder to do that when when you're when it's being redistributed from people you care about. It's easier to do that when it's being redistributed from a faceless group. When you're redistributing it from, let's say, the elderly to the young, it's easier to make that redistribution. It's easier to cut retirement benefits at that point, when there's no direct connection between the benefits going to somebody that and what's going to happen to them when their benefits are cut. It becomes less of an issue, because everybody becomes more focused on themselves, not focused on the common good. So, all of a sudden, that younger person who's being forced to pay higher healthcare costs and everything else, if they're going to say, look, I need to take care of my own family. I don't care I don't know these people. There is no relation. There is no family relationship there. I don't care. I just need more money in my pocket. They're going to revolt and say, hey, we want more money redistributed from the retirees, from their portfolios, from wherever. So we're going to take that money from them and give it back to us. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on. The thing that, and the reason, so at a macro level, that's why I dislike what's happening with the Social Security holiday and the way it's being proposed. It in the long run, it doesn't make sense. Here's the bigger problem. In the short run, it's very difficult to administer. And I'll give you a perfect example, and nobody really knows what the answer to this is yet, I don't think. It's a voluntary program. So let's say I'm the employer and you're working for me, and your pay, this pay period, I would normally withhold $1,000 worth of Social Security from you, and I would pay $1,000 in. Well, so I take the election. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put this money aside, and I'm going to use it. I don't have to put it aside. I don't actually have to escrow it. I don't collect it from you. I don't have to collect it, and I don't have to pay it in. So now what I've got is I've got this $2,000 for this pay period that I get to, that I don't have to give to the government. It's money I don't have to come up with. I don't have to take it out of the employee. So I can choose to let $1,000 go to the employee and they take home $1,000 more. So they have more money. I could choose to do that, which would be one of the options by deferring theirs. If I collect from them, I have to pay it in. So one of the things you can't do under this program is collect from the employee the $1,000 and then not turn it in, then spend it. You can't do that. So if you collect it, you still got to send it in. But you can say, I'm not going to collect it, so you make more money. So let's say I do that. I let you make $1,000 more this pay period. And let's say that works for 52 weeks, because I don't have to start paying this back for over a year. It's a little more than a year, I think. But I don't have to pay it back for a year. So now I've given you $52,000 more than you would have normally gotten. So you've had $52,000 over the year. But wait, it's not forgiven. It's got to be paid back. So now a year from now, actually a couple months before that, I have to start collecting back the 1,000. So now I have to take out your normal Social Security of 1,000 and the 1,000 I took out a year ago. So now all of a sudden your net pay is going to go down, not by the $1,000. It's in effect going to go down by $2,000. So your net pay, you're going to get a cut in pay a year from now. Not your gross pay, but your take-home pay. You're going to get a cut in pay. As your employer, I'm also going to get a cash payment that I have to make. So now I may have used that money on something else. I've got to borrow money or sell something or do something so that I can pay that money back to the government. So now where I would have only had to pay in $1,000, I have to pay another $1,000. So all of a sudden I'm getting hit big time on what I'm going to do. And so I've got to withhold from you to turn the money in. And then I also have to pay extra myself on you because I spent that money. Well, wait a minute. What if you don't work for me when it comes time to pay back? Where do I get the money from? You're not here anymore. How do I get my $1,000 back? Who's responsible for collecting that money? Your next employer? So now are you going to go to your next employer and say, so if you go to a different employer, you're going to get a cut in pay. And you may not be, so you're going to need a higher wage if you're trying to, so it's going to stop you from going and taking another job. It's going to, and we don't know who's going to have to pay. Is the employer going to have to pay the employer share of that, even though they didn't get that money? That money went to the previous employer. See, all of this stuff hasn't been thought through yet. It works out great if you forgive, but nobody's thought that through yet. What happens if the person that got the holiday isn't with you when it comes time to pay back the holiday? Do you have to take it from other people? Well, potentially. And so if you do, that means you have to reduce the salary of everybody that's there. So that could mean that a lot of people will change jobs, because if they go to a new employer, they don't have to have their salary reduced. But if they're the existing employer, somebody's going to take more money out of their pay because they've got to get this money from someplace. They've got to collect it from somewhere. So that's a big problem. Nobody has thought that through. And that's not a little thing. That's a big thing in terms of the disruption and the fact that somebody, we may have a lot of businesses that need to borrow money at that point in time, and the government will be out there borrowing a lot of money besides. So anyway, just think about that a minute. And again, some of these things, just take a world view, take a telescopic view instead of a wide angle view of it, and think about it. We'll talk about it in the future, and talk to you again here on WSTU Digital 1450, Martin County's Heritage Station.